I mean, one of the things I was struck when I read your book, Infidel, it was so interesting to see how you responded to Dutch culture, because I got to see what one of the Western countries looked like through the eyes of someone who was decidedly non-Western. I remember, for example, your amazement when you saw that a Dutch bus, that there was a sign indicating when a Dutch bus, public transportation bus, was going to arrive, and that it actually arrived at that time. And I thought that was an extremely powerful part of the book, because it is a kind of miracle that that sort of thing can occur. It requires an incredible amount of social organization. And Holland is a great example of a country that couldn't even exist without that large scale, tightly knit, almost machine-like organization, given that a huge proportion of their country would actually be underwater if it failed.
Right.
And you make a case in Infidel, and you're making a case now that in order for the West to develop an effective integration policy that would enable an effective immigration policy, that we have to have faith in our own values, the values that gave rise, say, to the idea of equal rights for women, to accept that the rise of that idea was something perhaps distinctively Western, and that we need to teach those, we need to have enough faith in those presumptions to teach them to newcomers. That strikes me, the probability that we're going to do that strikes me as extraordinarily low, if that's what's necessary, because I don't think, the last time I was in Holland, I was struck by the degree to which all the Dutch people that I talked to seemed to accept the proposition that they didn't really have much of a culture at all, that there was nothing particularly special about Dutch culture, or perhaps that it even existed, and certainly didn't feel that it was of sufficient quality to impose on other people. I think and how do you address, when you're criticized for being a neo-colonist, let's say, you're in such a strange position because of your where you were born and how you immigrated. And do you think that there is a danger in the Western assertion of primacy of value, for example? And is that such a danger that it mitigates against any attempts to assimilate immigrants, for example?
I think the way you started with, the bus arriving on time, and for something like that to happen, that a society that is hyper-organized, and you want to call that Western, I'm happy to call it Western, right? Some people just call it modernity. I don't know. Some people think it was just lucky. I think there's a bit of everything. But if you then look at societies where the bus doesn't come on time, that is one factor. And I just really like the time factor. In fact, we should just have one podcast only about that, things happening on time and in a predictable fashion for millions of people. How do you organize that? And I think that sort of makes Western society distinct from societies that haven't managed to find a way of dealing with time effectively and efficiently. The second thing is what we've been talking about all this time, and it's violence. That is suppressing male violence and channeling it so that it has other outlets instead of disrupting society and it being used against women. The third one I would say is money. And it is for societies to have these large surpluses where they can actually take care of the weak. They can afford compassion. Compassion is not just something you say, I feel sorry for you. We pay taxes so that we can pay for for the dispossessed. We can pay for their medical care. We can pay for their housing. And that, again, greatly enhances stability and social stability. And then finally, it's sex, which is not something that you can spontaneously have whenever, whatever, again, it's not perfect, but compared to some other societies, unwanted diseases, unwanted babies, rapes and sexual violence, all of that in Western societies seem to be really different. Now, you take those four factors and you say we're going to bring people in from, or people from societies who don't have that. Should we bring them into this, call it forced assimilation or just socialization or whatever you want to call it? But if we fail to do that and the number gets ever bigger, then we are going to have unstable societies. We're going to have, and the Dutch can say, and I've had the Swedes do the same thing. I've had Germans say the same thing to me, French. There is nothing uniquely different from my culture. Maybe because they take it for granted, because it's never been challenged. They all look alike, they think alike. And then one day...
Well, you do take whatever's around you all the time for granted. And it's clearly the case that we don't understand our own cultures, let alone other people's cultures.
You don't understand what you don't understand what you have until you don't have it anymore.
And what have you experienced the West as having, the values that should be transmitted to the immigrant population that we're inviting in? What's crucial in your estimation? And how do you communicate it? I mean, you tried to do that when you wrote Infidel.
Right. And I'm trying to do it again in this book. And I've tried to do it in Heretic. I try to do it in every book in using different sentences, but pretty much saying the same thing, which is, before I came to the Netherlands, I knew of the concept of freedom, but to me it was a dream. It wasn't something you had. So when I came to Holland, I was stunned, of course, in a good way. Mm-hmm. I felt safe as a woman in any kind of space. That's not something I was used to. I was told that I had equal rights before men. So when the man that my father married me off to, when he came to claim me, the woman at the asylum seeker center told me, you don't have to go with him. You can call the police. And we called the police, and I didn't go with him.
Right. I can remember how stunned you were, your account in Infidel, that the police were actually there to help you and that you could rely on them.
You can rely on them. And she explained, and then I said, what can I do in return? And she said, you don't have to do anything in return. This is the law. And that was the law when it was enforced. And again, that is something, she was just as shocked as I was. Because so there are places where they do this sort of thing, and it is, oh my goodness. So I can give you a whole list of things that I didn't have, and I even took it for granted that I didn't have those things. And then come to free societies, and then you can read as many books as you want. You can befriend whoever you want. You can sleep with whomever you want. You won't find, you might be rejected from this job or that job, but it is taken for granted that you can find your own employment. And if you do, you can keep the money that you make from that. I've been saying the same things over and over again. You can associate with whoever you want. Again, in our conversation when we started, Ali, I told you some of these things are changing, and they're not changing just because of external factors like Islam or immigration. They're changing from within, because a lot of us, people who are born and raised here for generations, have decided that they are disappointed in modernity. They call themselves postmodernists or critical race theorists or whatever you name it. But there's this ideology that's taking on. You can see it in newsrooms, in publication houses, tech world, and there is an alarming rejection of the fruits of modernity, of free speech, of all the things that I was impressed with when I came to the West. So
you contrast an Islamic attitude towards women with a Western attitude towards women. So do we say that that's a contrast between the Islamic attitude towards women and the Judeo-Christian attitude towards women? Is it reasonable to make that a religious issue? Or what do you think about that? I mean, it
is a religious issue. It's a cultural issue. It's also an issue of not only generating and being the motto behind modernity and constantly modernizing, which is what Western societies are constantly doing. And then obviously the religious component for me, when I analyze the leadership of Islam, is the disappointment with modernity and the rejection of that. And again, that is why I keep
What are
going
they
back to the
rejecting, do you think, that we've accepted? What are the differences that enables the emergence of the idea that women could be equal, or that they are equal, and that they should be, that equality should be fostered and treasured and developed? What's the difference? I'm not expecting you necessarily to know the answer to that, but it is the issue.
Yeah. Well, the issue is when you study the narrative that the radical Muslims preach and propagate, there is this deep disappointment that Islam is no longer the dominant force of the globe. And the answer that they give to that question is because they strayed away from the pure doctrine and the behavior of the Prophet, especially when he was in Medina and he had become so powerful. He had conquered not only Arabia, but then went beyond, and then his disciples went to almost every continent. And they were dominant. Then what went wrong? And I think people like Bertrand Russell and others have tried to give the answer that they came late to the game of modernity and then had these debates about, well, if we want to move forward and catch up with the West, whom they looked down on, then we have to become like them. That was the attempt that Kemal Atatürk made in Turkey. But then another force, a retrograde force, these are our modern Islamists, said, no, that is actually the wrong answer. We have to make them submit to us. And when I say they reject modernity, they like the gadgets and the nuclear weapons and that sort of modern stuff that makes them feel dominant or strong. But when it comes to adopting attitudes such as liberating women, they recoil from that. Absolutely, they recoil from that because they think that's what's going to take them apart. That's looking like them. Or running your societies according to that time machine that the West does. They think that that's all empty, looking at the clock all the time. So there are aspects about the West that they admire and want to incorporate, but the end goal is that it is not their goal to adopt some of these Western values. But a lot of people are voting with their feet. There are people who are poor, dispossessed, subjected to all sorts of violence, who want to come to the West and start all over again. And those are the people we're talking about. And I think to give those people a chance to actually become a part of modernity and modern society is to assimilate them. And the way to do it is just by admitting that some of the voting with the feet says it all.
Well, the classic response to that, the classic criticism of that perspective would be that those dispossessed people wouldn't have had to vote with their feet if the West hadn't engaged in its colonial mission and devastated the economic opportunities of 2/3 of the globe while elevating themselves to positions of unearned superiority. And of course, there's no shortage of evidence for that if that's the evidence that you choose to look at. And sorting that all out seems to be impossibly difficult. The West is guilty for all the crimes that have been committed in its name, and many of those crimes were real. And so we don't know how to uphold what we have of value while simultaneously atoning for our past sins. Maybe even the ways I would say we could at least admit that our past sins were the failure to live up to our values rather than the values themselves. But it's certainly not the case that everyone's going to agree to that. It's a real mystery why the idea of equality between the genders or equality between men
Human beings.
in general came about. To me, it seems to have a deep rooting in the idea of the universal soul and the intrinsic value of each person and the intrinsic value of each person's capacity for speech and creative production. I think that's a deeply Judeo-Christian idea. Its roots go deeper than that. I don't know if there is an Islamic equivalent.
I think, first of all, just by telling only one side of the story of what is making a lot of people in the West feel guilty and that they feel that they have to atone for, the colonization, the slavery, the segregation, all of these well-documented terrible things that Western societies have engaged in. That is one side of the story, but there's also another side of the story. And the other side of the story is that it is Westerners who took the initiative among humanity to change all of that, to end slavery, to end segregation, to aspire for equality. So if you're going to tell the story, then it's better to tell both sides of the story. Now, for the people who tell only the negative side of the story, who are toppling statues and saying the only way to redeem Westerners is for them to destroy everything and start all over again, I think even with those, aside from the obvious nihilism, the let's just destroy stuff, and the selective telling of the story, there's also an element of superiority in there.
An element of
superiority or supremacy, because only whites and Westerners are held responsible for bad things they did in the past or do today.
Do you mean about bad things that that happened altogether, or specifically the bad things that were perpetrated by Europeans? I mean, it's certainly the case that slavery was a human universal. It's not something unique to European society by any stretch of the imagination.
And so was colonialism. And so was and is segregation still to this day. Take a continent like India, where the caste system is still vibrant and healthy. Or take any of the Arab countries where people with my skin color are still regarded as slaves. So I think if you want to litigate history and all the things that were done bad by human beings, selecting only whites, and especially white men, and saying only they have to forever atone for their sins is in itself an expression of supremacy, because holding the Arabs and holding the Chinese right now are engaged in a genocide against the Uyghur people. We have reports of them forcibly sterilizing women. Why can't we hold them to the same moral standard that we are holding ourselves to?
So you think it's inappropriately colonialist for white Europeans to attribute universal human guilt to themselves?
It's an expression of supremacy. It's an expression of only we can meet those high, very high standards, not the rest of humanity. They are all victims in one way or the other, or we just take it for granted. They just can't do it. The Chinese and their violations of human rights, why even address it? They don't know how to do it. So do you see where there's the nihilism, there's the selective telling of the story, but like deep down when you read this stuff over and over again, it is like, actually, what you're saying is you can hold those standards to yourself, but not to me.
Well, I've never heard that argument before. It's extremely interesting and very darkly comical. What conclusion would you like your readers and anybody concerned with public policy to come to as a consequence of reading, well, let's say your books, Pray in particular, since it's your last book? Is it, you think that there is a clash of civilizations and that we should be aware of that? Its manifestations here and there. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Yeah, you're right. So there is indeed a clash, at least even if you don't want to call it a clash of civilizations, because people responded badly to that, you can call it unmistakably a clash of values. And in that encounter between the cultures and the value systems, the conclusion of this book is we can assimilate or integrate, whatever the Europeans call it, these young men who are dispossessed and who are vulnerable without sacrificing the rights of women.
But we can't do that unless we forthrightly confront the problems that are associated with a more open immigration policy.
And that is the first step. That is the first step. And even a step ahead of that is we have to have these conversations. So let's stop putting these issues, putting a taboo over these issues. We have to see the way these things are linked. If you want to do that, like stop using, you and I started our conversation with statistics, and stop using statistics as a tool of obfuscation, as a tool of lying about things that are going on. Let's use statistics and data actually to open, to solve these problems. And we can't if we keep on declaring, if we demonize one another and we moralize towards one another. And then we don't know where to go from there. So then we start compromising free speech. And so then you can't have these conversations. So maybe the first step is, I wish this book would only contribute to the opening of that conversation. It's not just about women. It's about this, how to coexist with one another in places in Europe, in America, on the globe.
I've had the distinct complicated pleasure of speaking with Ayaan Hirsi Ali today, and she's the author of multiple books, including this one, their newest, published in 2021, called Pray: Immigration, Islam, and the Erosion of Women's Rights. Ayaan is launching a podcast Monday, which is February 8th, and as well as launching her new website, which is ayaanhirsiali.com. I'd encourage anybody who wants to know more about Ayaan's thinking to visit her website and to attend to her podcast, which I'm sure will be very interesting, and no doubt perhaps more interesting than people will be able to tolerate. We'll see. Thank you very much for talking with me today, Ayaan. It was a pleasure to see you again.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you so very much. And we could have continued this for a good long time, but had to go to the kids. So thank you so much for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.